Am I on, Ricky? Is it okay? I can't hear myself sometimes, but maybe that's just because I'm aging. You laugh, but it's true. My hearings go. Okay, I won't. I don't have anything to complain about. Y'all are a lot older than me, um, and we won't start with comparisons, right? Because as human beings, that's what we like to do, right? We like to compare things. We love comparisons. I mean, you think about the number of things that we try to compare. I mean, when I think about comparisons, right? I'm thinking about pros and cons list. I'm thinking about positives and negatives. I'm thinking about what somebody does versus what somebody else does, right? And when I think about comparisons, I think about comparisons in the way that they are a way to measure the unmeasurable, right? Like baseball stats, okay? Let's just start there for a minute. There are more baseball stats than anybody in this room ever needs to know, and they are the most useless things that you could try to memorize and tell people back to, and they really, on a grand scheme of things, don't matter whatsoever. It's like football stats, right? But what they do is they allow us to measure what we look at and are unable to measure. Well, why do we think that, I don't even know how to say his name, Shohei Ohtani is the best batter in baseball? Well, it's because I said it wrong, didn't I? You're laughing at me, right? How do we know that he's the best batter in baseball? How do we know that? How do we know that Barry Bonds was the greatest home run hitter of the century? Well, the only way to measure it, right, is to look at stats because none of us were there. Well, maybe none of us, but there's no way to measure it. We're looking for measurables, and it's why we compare as human beings. We do it with all sorts of things, right? We do it with our jobs. We do it with, well, how do I know that I'm doing well in my job? Well, I measure that by comparing myself to a list of performance, right? Stats, sheets. Am I doing my job? Am I checking the list? Am I going above and beyond my job? And we like this because it gives us a way to see where we are. Now, with comparisons come some positives and negatives. But mostly we need to understand what the problem is when we're dealing with comparisons themselves. And the problem really comes for us when we start making comparisons, we start comparing ourselves to other people, right? Which we do a lot. Well, how do I know I'm doing well? Well, this person over here, well, it sins a whole lot more than me, right? For a Christian's sake. Well, he's not, well, he does X, Y, and Z, and I really don't do, so that makes me, right? Or I'm this way and that person's that way. Or you do it in your job, you do it in your work, you do it in your family, you do it with family members, you do it with people in the church. You look across the room, you start comparing. Well, how can I become that? I remember when I was a very new Christian, and maybe not even a Christian. One of my hangups was that I didn't feel like I could become what those people were. Because in my eyes, and the display that they put on in the church, right, on Sunday morning was that they had it all together and they had it perfect and they had the right doctrine and they did all the right things and that they had it all together. And in my mind, one of my hang-ups, one of the reasons why I didn't get baptized sooner was because I didn't feel like I could attain that kind of perfection, right? I didn't feel like I could be what those people were. And I started comparing myself. Well, they seem on the outside like they don't do this, they don't do that, they don't do this. They talk about these things from the pulpit. They pray this way, they look this way, they act this way around other people. How could I ever be like that? And then they would talk about things like, well, you got to be like Jesus. And they would talk about how to be like Jesus. But then they would act like they themselves were like Jesus, like they were perfect. And I just couldn't wrap my mind around how do I become that? How do I become? I desired to do good things and be good and not sin and try to make the right decisions. But I continuously fail, and I know I continuously fail, even though I don't confess it to anybody. And nobody else is confessing it to me, but then I read passages like Romans chapter 3 and verse 23. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So what is going on in these people's lives behind closed doors that they're not sharing with their brethren? And this is why I'm big on confessing sin. This is why I'm big on telling your brethren what you're struggling with. This is why I'm big on letting people know where you are. not for the sake of judging someone else, but for the sake of understanding that everyone is imperfect. No one has attained perfection. No one's got it all down. No one's got it all right. We all do things wrong at different times in our life. And so the point of comparing, that becomes a negative experience. It becomes something negative we do that actually brings us down. And this is, but there are positives to comparisons too, right? There are positives to how we use them, not just how we see them or what we think of them, but how we use them, right? If we're comparing positively, we might gain some growth, right? We might be able to see, hey, these are areas where I need to grow that I haven't grown in a long time. We might strengthen, or we might be able to gain more confidence, right? We might be able to okay, well, if I'm comparing, like for example, we'll go into the book of Hebrews, if I'm going to begin to compare Jesus with all of the things we see within the old law, well, then that might build my confidence. That might boost me up a little bit. That might push me in the right direction. That might help me feel more confident about sharing the gospel with my lost friends. That might make me more confident in my personal relationships, in my marriage relationship, in understanding that, God has grace and He gives it to all of us. All I have to do is ask. All I have to do is receive it. All I have to do is be humble, right? It might build our confidence in a good spiritual way, right? It might give us encouragement. Comparisons in a positive way can encourage us, can boost us up, can build us up, right? They're not for everything, right? But they might give us encouragement for the things that we're struggling with. In a negative manner, we might see decline. We might see spiritual decline. We might see financial decline. We might see relational declines. We might see some sort of depression in the life of people if we're applying comparisons negatively and saying, well, I could never be like that. How could I be like that? How could I attain that thing? I could never do that. I've got too many problems, too many issues. I can do that. And so why even try? Why even take the risk? Right? Or on the opposite effect, we might see arrogance. Well, I'm not like that. I may be in the category of the Pharisee and the publican, and mainly the Pharisee. I thank you, God, that I'm not like this sinner over here. Might breed arrogance in my life. Might bring discouragement to me, right? In a negative manner, when I'm comparing in a negative way, it can bring discouragement. And I have to be aware of these things as a Christian because they are important. I don't think we often differentiate the two, right? We don't have a sense of, well, how do we apply this in a positive way and how do we apply this in a negative way? Usually it's, for all intents and purposes, a negative way. And when we're applying things in a negative way, right? When we make comparisons negatively, it cripples our confidence. When we think about the negatives of comparisons, it just shatters people. And this is what we're dealing with in the book of Hebrews. We've got a group of first century Jewish Christians who are thinking about returning to Judaism under the heavy Jewish persecution. The book was written between 63 and 65, so it was still under that time period where they were receiving persecution from Jewish people. Their families were disowning them. Their synagogues were pushing them out. They weren't allowed to associate with people. There was heavy Jewish persecution. And they were thinking about, well, this Christian thing in my life really isn't working out. Right? So I may as well just go back to Judaism. And they were thinking negatively in terms of why they were following Jesus. Why do I need to follow Jesus? Why do I continue following Jesus if there's all this negativity in my life? And in fact, if I go back to Judaism, people will gladly accept me, and all of a sudden, I won't have any of this turmoil and trouble that I've had for the last period of my life. Comparisons used negatively cripple our confidence. And usually just talking negatively, thinking negatively about yourself cripples your confidence, your ability to risk take, your ability to say, I'm going to go and do that and have confidence in doing it. This is where we're landing in the book of Hebrews. So he starts the book with this idea, this this really important idea that I don't think we often grasp, that God spoke. Because in the first century world, there were a lot of gods. There were polytheistic believers. The Jews were the only monotheistic believers. And a lot of the polytheistic believers had mute gods. So this is very important in a first century culture, where it's like God spoke. Our God spoke, right? He wasn't just there, and he didn't just demand something from us, and he didn't just want us to do something to be pleasing to him. He spoke to us. How did he speak to us? Well, in past times, he spoke to us by the fathers in the prophets. And then he says, in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. Well, what do you mean? Well, I didn't really consider the Son when I was thinking about all this persecution and things that were going on in my life. I didn't really give that a second thought. I didn't really consider that the way that God has spoken to us now is far superior to the way that God spoke to us by the prophets, in the fathers by the prophets. And that in these last days, there's a direction, there's something better, there's something bigger. And he uses this word son, right? As identifying a personal relationship between the Father and the Son, right? Those of you who have sons. Or those of you who have dads, or remember when your dad was still alive. Those of you who had good relationships with your father. Do you remember what your relationship was like? Do you remember how maybe you were prioritizing life? I had a good father. He prioritized me in his life. He made me a part of his life. When I asked him for things, he gave me things. When he was proud of the things that I did, he talked about me to his friends, bragged on me about to his friends. I mean, there's a relationship aspect, and there are things that we don't consider about the personal relationship between God the Father and Jesus the Son, and why this is so important to the Jewish people. Not only would it have been blasphemy or heresy or to some nature, because most of the Jews didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, but they did believe that a Son of God was coming. A Son of Man was coming. God's sent was coming to redeem humanity as a whole. It's just their picture was a little off. They had this problem with seeing God's big picture and seeing the grand scheme of things and seeing things the way that God saw things. You see, God is always 4, 5, 6, 7 moves ahead of us in sight. When we get a picture or we see something that we know we need to do, we're only seeing the first frame. There's several other frames that if we're looking and we're watching and we're trying to see the big picture, we can see it all the way out. We can see the endings, the split endings, the directions that it goes. So here's what the Hebrew writer is trying to get across. So we're going to start back in the middle of verse 3, because I really think that the middle of verse 3 is actually part of verse 4. And he starts like this. When he had made purification of sins, when he had died on the cross, resurrected, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. He sat down at the right hand in a position of power, right? In a position of power. So here's the image we have. It's like there's this figure that we worship, that we love, that we follow, that redeemed us for our sins. You know this. And if you're thinking about going back to Judaism, where you have this high view of angelic beings, I want you to consider the Son that you follow. And he's going to say this later. Consider Jesus. Consider Jesus, the Son, having become much better than the angels. You see, they believed that angels were the ones that delivered the message to Moses on Mount Sinai. They held angels in very high regard. They were God's messengers. They were direct speakers. I mean, you look at the beginning chapters of Matthew, you see them all over. They came to Joseph in a dream and spoke to him. They came to Mary and they spoke to her. They were all over the place. They had this high view of angels as God's messengers. And there was just some disconnect as to why they couldn't separate themselves from that ancient culture. Here he goes. Much better than the angels, as he has inherited a more excellent name than they. This Jesus that you follow, this Jesus that you love, this Jesus that you serve, he's much better than the angels. He's much better than any angelic being you could possibly think of or imagine. I mean, you put this emphasis on, well, this is how God speaks to people. But God, that's the way God spoke to people. Jesus is the way God speaks to us now. And he inherited more excellently. Well, why? I mean, start thinking about it. We could go super deep into this, but we're for the sake of time, I'm going to let you figure that out this week when you're reading the book of Hebrews by yourself, okay? When you're discerning and you're writing notes and you're thinking through these things. Think about this verse. Here it goes. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5 and 6, and it's a quotation. So right in this verse, you're going to see a quote, a mark from Hebrews, and then a mark from a psalm or an Old Testament passage that he uses in order to make his point about the relationship between the Father and the Son and the relationship between the Creator and angels. Right? And he's going to elevate Jesus, elevate this Son as higher than the angels. That's what we're going to do in this picture as he's giving it to us. To which of the angels did he ever say, "You are my Son. Today I have begotten you"? Which of the angels? I mean, think about this argument. It's miraculous. Miraculous. If you're a first century Jew sitting in a synagogue listening to this message, you're going, wait a minute. I know that verse. That speaks to Jesus? I mean, of course we know that speaks to the Messiah, but it speaks to Jesus? I mean, we're thinking about turning back to Judaism, and this is what God is saying about his Son. "You are my Son, today I have begotten you, and again I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me." The relationship between the two. And he's contrasting. He's like, this isn't something that God has with angels. This isn't a relationship that God has with angelic beings. Angelic beings are ministering spirits, as he's going to say in verse 14. And they are nothing more. They are nothing more than that. But the Son is. Because he sat down after he made purification for sin, he sat down at the right hand of God. And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "Let all the angels of God worship him." You see the direction that he's pulling here? This is important. Because what he's drawing us into is he's saying, let all the angels of God, the angels that you hold so in such high regard, these beings, these messengers that you think are so far above you, so far above anything else you could possibly imagine, they were to worship Jesus. And let all the angels of God worship him. A quotation from Psalm 97 and verse 7. Here it goes again. And of the angels, he says, who makes his angels spirits and his ministers flames of fire. He's going to start to show us the difference between the Son and angelic beings. But of the Son, he says, this is what he says of angels, right? Back here. This is what he says of angels. This is what God says. This is what God speaks of the Son. But of the Son, he says, listen to this. Your throne, O God. You see that? He doesn't call the angels God. This is God calling God, God. Identifying a characteristic. I mean, think about it. Put yourself in those shoes. If I'm considering leaving to go back to something that I came out of because it's less persecution, what am I giving up for that? That I serve God, that the God of the universe put himself upon the cross, died for my sins, and then asked me to follow him through the thick of life, through the trials, through the temptations, through the hardships. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. You reign eternally. And the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore, God, again, God speaking to or about Jesus. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your companions. Above other angelic beings. I mean, this is just magnificent stuff. It's not too terribly difficult to understand. But he's starting to show us the contrast. Because there's really, in their minds, I don't think there's a differentiation. I think for us, I mean, we're kind of scared of the concept, right? It's kind of scared of the concept of angels. We don't talk about it because it's a little bit weird and we really don't know a whole lot about it, right? Which is fine. But evidently they're there, right? Evidently they're working. Evidently they're all ministering spirits to those who will inherit salvation. Evidently they're doing some kind of work, but they're not doing the work that Jesus is doing, right? Therefore, your God has anointed you. I have appointed you, anointed you. I mean, you go back up to chapter 1 and verse 2, where he says, he appointed him the heir of all things. Right? He appointed him the heir of all things, the king of the kingdom, the righteous ruler, the prince of peace. He is this figure that is not low. I mean, then look at this. And you, Lord, in the beginning, right? Talking about Jesus, laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. Again, a quotation from Psalms. But what he's trying to get us to see, and what he's trying to get these first century Jewish people to see, is that it's really not worth it. It's really not worth it. I mean, you're thinking about going back to the system, and we're going to make this argument throughout the entire book, but you're thinking about going back to the system that relies on daily, yearly, quarterly sacrifices. You're thinking about going back to this system that requires a weight upon your shoulders. You're thinking about going back to the system that, yeah, for a time served a purpose, but really it was all leading to Jesus. It was all pointing us to this moment where God was going to once for all make purifications for sin of the entire world, and God was going to stretch his hand out to humanity through the good news, and all we had to do was receive it. All we had to do was accept it. All we had to do was see it, believe it, and act upon it, because God had done it. It was done. It was finished. And the heavens are the works of your hand. They will perish in comparison. They will perish, but you remain, and they all will become old like a garment, and a robe you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will also be changed, but you are the same. There's no change in you. And your years will not come to an end. Pay attention to this. But to which of the angels, this is the important part, to which of the angels, he goes back to that statement, to which of the angels, the messengers, these beings you hold so high, to which of the angels did he ever say, sit at my right hand? Sit at my right hand. See, he draws us back to verse 3. Draws us back to the beginning. He draws us back to the character. He draws us back to the Son, being the exact imprint of his nature, the radiance of his glory. This individual held in high esteem by God. Exalted not because he was just the best of the best, but because he had the humility. But because he was God. But because he was living in the human form, and he did what no human could ever do. He did what no man had ever done. And he allowed us to continue and have a relationship with God until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Sit at my right hand. Sit in this position of power. Until I make those opposers, those people who are against you, merely a rest for your feet. Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation? So what's the argument here? What's the understanding? The Hebrew writer is not finished with this concept of comparing Jesus and the angels, but this is just the beginning steps of showing us the difference between the Son and the messenger. Now, this is kind of a disconnect for us as Christians in the 21st century, because we don't look at the things the same way as they did, roughly 30 to 40 years after the death of Jesus. We weren't ingrained. We weren't brought up in Judaism. We weren't looking at the traditions of our fathers and saying, well, this is a part of our life, This is who we are. This is what we're part of. And all of a sudden that thing has changed. God has moved. God has made a move to save all of humanity. Now I'm left with a decision. Choose the God of the universe and receive His gospel and be rejected by my family, my friends, my mentors, the people I work for, or receive the good news and live life eternal. Are they not all ministering spirits? You see, brings it down on a level. So they're nothing more than just beings who are sent out to serve. This is the relationship between one of the fathers. I mean, it's not a creator angelic relationship. Clearly, from the first chapter of Hebrews, we can see that. So here's his point that he wants to make, that he wants us to understand. The Son is superior to all other spiritual beings. That's the baseline point that the Hebrew writer is trying to make in the first chapter. Because he starts out with what they would see as the most, high up creatures, right? The most elevated beings that they could possibly figure. But the problem really lies in what he's about to do in the book. Is he's about to compare a whole bunch of things that potentially we will struggle to understand the relationship between. But from a Jewish context, they would understand very, very clearly. Here's what he's going to do. In response to this idea, response to this mass leaving of or even this consideration of leaving Jesus back to Judaism, he's going to make this takeaway, and I think it's important for us to understand too. I think all of us to some degree will understand what this means. And that is, what is good with us isn't always good for us. In other words, what we become content with, what becomes familiar, what becomes comfortable, what we know, what's good with us, right? What's happening around us that's okay with what's happening isn't always good for us. The point he's trying to make, the point that the writer is going to continue to make, is that sometimes what's comfortable is not always good for you. I mean, we live in a world of convenience, don't we? We live in a world where you can go to the grocery store and buy your lunch. You can go to the grocery store, buy all the things you need to make your lunch. You can go to a fast food restaurant, get your lunch made for you. We live in a world of convenience. We live in a world of comfort. We don't know discomfort. We don't know persecution. We don't know what it's like to be, I mean, maybe some of us do, but we don't know what it's like to be cut off from family and friends because we've taken a different belief system than they. Some of us might, but most of us don't. We live in a world of convenience. And so we think what's good with us, right? What's good with us is always good for us. But it's actually the opposite that we need to consider. What's good with us is maybe not the thing we need to be doing. In other words, let's take this into a real life situation. How many of us have been going to church for, I'm not going to include myself in this category, but how many of you have been going to church for 30 plus years? Just raise your hand. Put your hand up. You're going to church for 30 plus years. You've been doing the same things all of your life, right? You've been coming on Sunday morning. You've been coming to Bible class. You've been hearing a sermon, right? You've been doing the same things. Or did you have times of growth? Yes. Did you have times of decline? Yes. Did you have times where you struggled with sin? Did you have times where you were under trial? Did you have times where you just weren't growing at all? Did you have times or seasons in your life where there was no progress? Have you become content with where you are? Is really the question we need to be asking. Have you become content with where you are spiritually? With where you are in your relationship with God? When was the last time it grew? When was the last time it expanded? When's the last time you made a shift that was uncomfortable to make yourself grow? What if tomorrow we couldn't do this anymore? What if tomorrow the government decided that Christianity was a threat to national security? What would we do? How would the church look? Would we meet in homes? Would we defy the government? What would we do? What would we be willing to do? Because we get comfortable here. We get comfortable with the things that we're doing every Sunday. You get comfortable in the clothes you wear here. You get comfortable with the people you're around. You get comfortable with, guess what? Tomorrow, after service today, you're probably going to go to lunch. Maybe you'll come back here tonight. Maybe you won't. But most of us are going to work tomorrow. And we're going to have a set of work things to deal with. And we're going to do the same things at work. And maybe we'll forget what we heard here on Sunday morning. Maybe we won't. Maybe we'll come back next Sunday and not remember a thing we learned here. Maybe there will be no growth during the week because we're just so comfortable with where we are. Because we're good with what's good with us. And we don't understand that sometimes growth gets really uncomfortable. And it feels like pain. And it feels like we're doing something wrong because we're shifting out of a mold, or we're shifting into a different way of thinking, or we're making an adjustment. And it feels wrong, but it's not always wrong. And that's part of the growth. It gets uncomfortable. It gets messy. It gets tension. Am I doing something wrong? Am I doing something right? I don't know what I'm doing anymore because I was comfortable with this and I did this for so long in my life that now I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing. I roll into the same types of issues. Come across a passage of Scripture that I thought I knew. All of a sudden I study the context. It changes instantly. I see something in the world around me that maybe God is using to teach me. An event, maybe. An experience with an individual. A thought that drives me in a different direction. Yeah, those things make me uncomfortable. But it's my duty to be more curious. Because my duty is not to stay where I am. My duty is not to continue to be what I've always been. My duty is to become more like Jesus. My duty is to make those uncomfortable decisions. My duty is to not stay the same for the next 30 years. If I want to continue to have a growing, thriving relationship with God, then I have to get uncomfortable. And I have to understand that what's good for me isn't always going to be something that's good with me. If I'm understanding of that concept, if I'm understanding of that idea, then I can make strides of growth. Then when times of persecution comes all of a sudden it doesn't feel so unfamiliar. To be facing something that's causing disruption in my life. All of a sudden it doesn't become so unfamiliar, so wrong, because now I'm dealing with it in a different manner. We're going to pick up right in chapter 2 next week. I hope you'll join us. I hope you'll invite your friends and family. If you are interested in studying or learning more, I would be happy to sit down with you. If you have questions, whatever it may be, I've got a Bible on this thing. I've got paper Bibles. I've got plenty of ways that we can sit down and discuss things or maybe you're just wanting to know more about how the story of Scripture all unfolds and all comes together. I don't know where you're at in your life, but if you have something you need, if you would like to sit down for a Bible study, I'm open to it. And I'll be more than happy to show you what I can. If you have a need of any kind, as is our custom here at the Pleasant View Church of Christ, we offer an invitation. And it's an opportunity for those who may have been seeking or may have been looking for something or may be on a path towards following Jesus, where you need to take that next step in your journey. Become a baptized member of the body of Christ. You can do that this morning as we stand and sing.